I want to tell you something, and I need you to really sit with me for a minute while I do, because this story, this whole thing, it still makes my chest tight when I think about how close I came to losing everything. Not just money, not just a house. I mean, my mama. I almost lost my mama, not to her illness, but to a woman who smiled in my face for 2 years while she was quietly stealing everything that mattered. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning was actually beautiful. And I think that's the part that hurts the most, how good it all felt before everything went wrong. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am so happy you're here with me again today. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you're listening from. I love seeing where in the world you all are. And if you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. Okay, let's get into it. Part 1, The Sweetest Start. My mama, Gloria Jean, she's the kind of woman who makes a room warmer just by walking into it. She's got this laugh that you can hear from 2 rooms away, and her cornbread, Lord, her cornbread has been the centerpiece of every holiday table our family has sat around since before I was born. She raised me and my brother Marcus in a little 3-bedroom house in Greensboro, North Carolina, on a teacher's salary and pure stubbornness. Our daddy passed when I was 11, and she never once let us feel like we were missing something. She filled every gap herself. I'm her daughter, Renee Michelle Carter, 43 years old at the time all this happened, living about 40 minutes away in Durham, working as an office manager for a mid-size accounting firm. I wasn't rich, but I was stable. I owned my townhouse, I had a reliable car, and I called my mama every single morning on my drive to work. Every morning. That was our thing. Marcus, my brother, he'd moved to Phoenix about 8 years before all this started. He and Mama had a decent enough relationship. He'd call on birthdays and holidays, send money when she needed something fixed around the house. But he wasn't present the way I was. That's just how it shook out. I was the one who drove over on Sundays. I was the one who took her to her doctor's appointments. I was the one who knew her pharmacist by first name. When Mama got her diagnosis, type 2 diabetes that had progressed further than we'd realized, combined with some early signs of heart trouble, I didn't panic. I was scared, sure, but Mama was stubborn and she was strong, and her doctors were good. What we needed, they told us, was someone to help with daily care. Mama's mobility was starting to be affected. She was having trouble cooking full meals, managing her medications consistently, and getting around the house safely. She needed, and I hate this word, she hated this word, a caregiver. She resisted for months. I don't need some stranger in my house, she told me, sitting in her kitchen with her arms crossed, looking every bit as formidable as she always had. I've been running this house since 1987, and I'm not about to hand it over to somebody I don't know. I understood. I did. But I also knew what her cardiologist had said, and I knew that I couldn't move in with her. I'd tried to bring it up, and she'd nearly thrown me out. And Marcus was in Phoenix with his own family. We needed help. A woman from Mama's church, Sister Thelma, mentioned that she knew someone, a professional caregiver, experienced, sweet, wonderful with elderly clients. She'd worked with Thelma's own mother-in-law for a year before the woman passed, and Thelma said she couldn't say enough good things. Her name was Sandra Lee Watkins. I will never forget the first time I met Sandra. She came to Mama's house on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad like I was interviewing someone for an executive position, which, honestly, I kind of was. This was my mama. I wasn't playing around. Sandra pulled up in a clean white Honda Civic right on time. She knocked instead of ringing the bell, something that struck me as oddly considerate because Mama had mentioned she sometimes napped in the early afternoon. She was dressed neatly, pressed khakis and a soft blue blouse, and she was carrying a little tin of homemade tea cakes wrapped in cellophane with a ribbon on top. "I always bring something when I meet someone new," she said, handing them to Mama with his wide, genuine-looking smile. "My grandmother taught me that." Mama looked at those tea cakes and her whole face softened, just like that. Sandra was 51 years old, a little heavyweight in a comfortable, warm way, with silver-streaked hair she kept pulled back and these reading glasses that sat on the end of her nose and made her look like everybody's favorite librarian. She sat down at that kitchen table and she talked to my mama like she'd known her for years, asked about her garden, asked about the photos on the wall, asked about Daddy, and when Mama showed him a photo of him and got a little quiet, Sandra just nodded and said, "He had kind eyes, I can tell." Mama reached over and patted Sandra's hand. I sat there watching all of this and I thought, this is it. This is the one. I did my due diligence, I want to say that. I called 3 of Sandra's references, all elderly clients or their adult children, and every single person sang her praises. One woman cried a little talking about how much Sandra had meant to her father in his final years. I checked the state caregiver registry. No complaints, no red flags, license current and clean. She was certified in medication management, CPR, first aid, and had taken additional coursework in cardiac care specifically. We worked out a schedule. Sandra would come 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She'd help Mama with meals, medications, light housekeeping, and getting to her appointments. On weekends, I would cover. Marcus said he'd come visit when he could. The first few months were honestly some of the best we'd had in a while. Mama's health stabilized. Her blood sugar numbers improved dramatically because Sandra was meticulous about her diet. Not in a controlling way, but in a creative one. She'd find ways to make Mama's favorite foods in versions that fit her dietary restrictions, and Mama would eat them and say, "This is almost as good as mine," which from Gloria Jean was basically a standing ovation. I'd stop by 2 or 3 times a week after work, and the house would be clean, Mama would be settled and comfortable, there'd be something warm on the stove. Sandra always had a warm smile and a little update for me. Mama had a good day, or Mama's knee had been bothering her, so they took it slow, or Mama had told her a funny story about when Marcus and I were little. I started to relax. Really relax. For the first time in about a year, I wasn't driving to work with that low hum of anxiety in my chest. I felt like we'd found our footing. Sandra started joining us sometimes when I came for Sunday dinner. At first, I invited her because she was there and it seemed rude not to not. Then Mama started asking if Sandra was coming on Sundays. They'd watch their church programs together on Saturday mornings, and Sandra brought her own Bible and they'd do devotional sometimes in the afternoon. I thought it was sweet. I thought God had sent us exactly who we needed. Part 2. Small Things I Didn't Want to See. Looking back, the first thing that should have made me pause happened about 4 months in. It was so small I barely registered it, and when I did, I talked myself right out of it. I'd come by on a Wednesday evening, unannounced. I'd gotten off work early and thought I'd surprise Mama, maybe take her out for a little drive since the weather was nice. I let myself in with my key. Sandra was still there, even though it was closer to 5 than 4. That wasn't the odd part. Sometimes she stayed a little late if Mama was in the middle of something. What was odd was that she had Mama's address book open on the kitchen table, the little red address book Mama kept in the drawer by the phone, the one with phone numbers going back decades, some of them written in my daddy's handwriting. She closed it when I came in, quick, but not so quick that I didn't see it. "Oh, Renee, I didn't hear you come in," she said, smiling. "Your Mama's resting. She had a great day." I looked at the address book. "What were you doing with that?" and she had an answer ready, said she and Mama had been talking about one of Mama's old friends, a woman named Birdie who'd moved away years ago, and Mama thought she might have a number in the book, and they'd been trying to find it. She said they didn't end up finding it, but maybe I'd know how to get in touch. I accepted this completely. I didn't even think about it again for a month. Around month 5, Mama said something that I filed away as just Mama being Mama, but it comes back to me now with a whole different weight. We were talking on the phone one morning, our usual call, and I mentioned that I was thinking about coming over that Saturday instead of Sunday because I had something going on Sunday afternoon. Mama said, "Oh, well, I'll let Sandra know." I said, "Mama, you don't need to let Sandra know anything about my visits. Sandra doesn't work Saturdays." And Mama said, a little flustered, "Well, I know, she likes to know what the schedule is. She worries." At the time, I thought it was just Mama being considerate. Sandra had mentioned to both of us that her schedule was tight, and it helped her to know when family would be around so she could plan accordingly. I thought that was professional and organized, normal. But that wasn't what was happening. There was also the small matter of Mama's old friends sort of drifting away, but that one I really did not see coming for a long time. Mama had a group of women she'd known for 40 years, church friends, former colleagues from the school where she taught, neighbors from years past. They called, they visited, they'd go to lunch. Slowly, over about 6 months, those calls started to thin out. I noticed it in passing, mentioned to Mama that I hadn't heard her talk about Miss Carolyn in a while. Mama sort of waved her hand and said Miss Carolyn had been calling at bad times when she was tired, and it was just easier to let it go to voicemail. Said they'd catch up. I thought, fair enough. Mama's energy was limited. It made sense that she was being selective about when she visited and talked. I didn't push it. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that Sandra had been answering Mama's phone when she thought those calls were inconvenient. She'd been telling Mama's friends that Gloria wasn't feeling well, wasn't up for visits, wasn't taking calls. Politely, sweetly, with great concern in her voice, steering people away, one by one, so slowly that nobody registered what was happening. But that was months down the road. The thing that made me first genuinely uncomfortable, the first thing I couldn't quite explain away, happened right around the 8-month mark. I came to take Mama to a routine cardiology appointment. When I got there, Sandra was in the kitchen and Mama was getting her shoes on, and Sandra said very casually, "Oh, I can take her if you want. I've been taking her to the smaller appointments, saves you a trip." I froze. "You've been taking her to appointments?" Mama looked up from her shoe. "Just the blood work ones, baby, the little ones. Sandra doesn't mind." "Why didn't either of you tell me that?" Mama and Sandra exchanged a look, just a quick one, a half second, but I caught it, like they'd had a whole conversation about how I might react to this. Sandra said very reasonably, "I probably should have mentioned it. I just thought I was being helpful. You're so busy, Renee, and Gloria's so easy, it's really no trouble." I said that I appreciated it, but that I wanted to be at all of Mama's appointments, even the smaller ones. Sandra nodded and said, of course, absolutely, whatever I preferred. But there it was. My mother had started going places without me knowing, and something about the way they'd looked at each other, that quick little glance, had made me feel for just a second like a guest in my own Mama's life. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was what good caregivers did, that I should be grateful instead of territorial. But I think, somewhere underneath, I knew something was off. I just wasn't ready to believe it yet. Part 3. The Temperature Rising. Around month 10, Mama's estate attorney called me. His name was Gerald Whitmore, an older gentleman who'd handled Mama's will and her small trust for about 15 years. I'd met him once or twice at the house when paperwork needed signing. He called me at work on a Thursday, and when his name came up on my screen, I thought maybe it was about something routine, updating a beneficiary, confirming a document, something administrative. "Renee," he said, "I just wanted to give you a call because your mother came in last week with her caregiver, and she asked me some questions about adjusting certain aspects of her estate plan." I sat up very straight. "What kind of adjustments?" He paused. He was clearly choosing his words carefully. "She asked about the possibility of adding someone to the trust as a beneficiary. I told her I'd need to review everything, and that given her medical situation, there are certain steps we take to ensure the documentation is sound. She said she'd think about it and follow up." I said, very quietly, "Mr. Whitmore, who did she want to add?" Another pause. "Her caregiver, Sandra Watkins. She said she wanted to make sure Sandra was taken care of." I don't have a word for what I felt in that moment. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something closer to the floor dropping out from under me, like the world had just shifted 1 degree and everything I'd been standing on was now at a slight, terrible tilt. I thanked Mr. Whitmore and hung up, and I sat at my desk for a long time, not doing anything. Then I called Mama. "Mama," I said, keeping my voice very even, "did you go see Mr. Whitmore last week?" A beat. "How did you hear about that?" "He called me. He said you want to change your will." "It's my will, Renee." "I know that, Mama. I'm not saying it's not. I'm asking you, is this something you want to do, or is this something Sandra suggested?" And Mama got a little huffy, which was so like her, and she said Sandra hadn't suggested anything, that she herself had brought it up because Sandra had done so much for her and she wanted to show her appreciation. She said I should understand that. She said Sandra was like family now. I said okay. I said I loved her. I said we'd talk more on Sunday. I hung up and I sat with that for 2 days. Part of me, a big part, wanted to believe it was exactly what Mama said it was, a generous impulse from a generous woman who'd always loved fiercely and given freely. Mama had given money to her church, to her kids' school fundraisers, to neighbors in need her whole life. Adding someone kind to her will wasn't outside the realm of who she was. But something about Sandra being at that meeting, something about the way Mama had said, "How did you hear about that?" Slightly guarded, slightly caught, like she hadn't expected it to come back to me. That Sunday, I came over and we had a careful conversation where I didn't press too hard because I didn't want Mama to feel like I was challenging her or treating her like she couldn't make her own decisions. I just said gently that I thought we should all discuss it together before anything changed. Mama agreed, a little reluctantly. Sandra, who was there making lunch, said nothing, but she smiled at me over Mama's head with this warm, understanding look, like she thought my concern was adorable. I drove home with a rock in my stomach. Over the next month, I started paying closer attention, and once I started paying closer attention, I couldn't stop seeing things. Sandra had started answering Mama's cell phone. Not all the time, but often enough that I noticed. I'd call, and Sandra would pick up, say Mama was resting or in the bathroom, offer to take a message. Normal enough on the surface, but there was a pattern developing where the in-between space, the space between me calling and me actually reaching my mother, was getting longer. I started just showing up, unannounced, on random weekday mornings before work. The visits were always fine. Sandra was always pleasant, always professional, but Mama seemed slightly different when I arrived versus by the time I'd been there an hour, like she'd been reminded of something she'd set aside. I also noticed that Sandra had started referring to Mama's house as our home. Subtle, easy to miss. She'd say things like, "We need to get that porch light fixed," or "I was thinking we could rearrange the living room, give Gloria more space to move around." We, our, as if she lived there. She didn't live there, or she wasn't supposed to. It was Marcus who told me 3 weeks after that Sunday conversation that Mama had mentioned Sandra had been staying over sometimes. Marcus told me on the phone, "She said Sandra's been staying over a couple of nights a week. I figured you knew." I did not know. I called Mama. She confirmed it casually, like it was nothing. "Sandra's been staying over a couple of nights a week, baby. It's just easier. She's right there if I need anything." "Mama, that's not what we hired her for. She has a home. She doesn't mind. That's not the point." We went back and forth, gently, and in the end, Mama said she was comfortable with the arrangement, and it was her house, and she appreciated my concern, but she didn't think it was a problem. She sounded a little rehearsed, which was scaring me more than anything else she'd said. I am not someone who panics. I am not someone who escalates unnecessarily. But that night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and I said to myself out loud to no one, "Something is very wrong." Part 4, Sandra's Time with Mama. My brother Marcus came to visit from Phoenix. He'd been wanting to see Mama, and I was glad for another pair of eyes, another perspective. Marcus is a calm, measured guy, not someone who jumps to conclusions. If he saw something, I knew I wasn't imagining things. He came on a Friday, and I drove over to meet him. When we walked in together, Sandra was in the living room with Mama, and the whole scene was warm and comfortable, tea out, the television on low. Sandra stood up and welcomed Marcus like she'd known him forever, told him how much Mama talked about him, how wonderful it was to finally meet him. Marcus was charmed. Within an hour, he was calling her Miss Sandra and laughing at her jokes. But later that night, after Sandra had gone home, her actual home for once, the three of us had dinner together, just us, and Marcus brought up the will thing on his own. He'd talked to Mr. Whitmore himself, it turned out, because Whitmore had reached out to him as well, being thorough. "I'll be honest," Marcus said, cutting into his chicken. "I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't want to assume the worst about somebody who's been so good to Mama." Mama said, "I wish you two would stop treating it like it's some big scandal. I'm a grown woman." "Nobody's saying you're not, Mama," Marcus said. "We're saying we love you and we want to understand." And then Mama said something that stopped both of us cold. She said, "Sandra has been here every single day. You two have your lives. I know you love me, but when you're not here, she is, and she makes me feel safe." We drove home separately that night, and Marcus called me from his rental car. "Okay," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, more serious. That felt like something she'd been told to say. "I know," I said. "We need to figure out what's actually going on." It was around month 14 that things shifted from concerning to genuinely alarming. Mr. Whitmore called me again. Mama had come back in, this time without calling ahead and without Sandra present, which he'd noted as unusual because Sandra had been with her every other visit. Mama had come in and she'd told Whitmore she wanted to move forward with the changes to the will. Whitmore, God bless him, had done his job. He'd had a separate, private conversation with Mama about the change. He told me carefully that in his professional assessment, Mama understood what she was doing and appeared to be acting of her own free will. but he had also noted that when he'd asked her how she'd come to this decision, she'd said, "Sandra said she's getting older too and doesn't have family who'll look after her. I want her to know she's secure." That right there, that phrase, "Sandra said," Whitmore hadn't moved forward. He told Mama he needed time to prepare the documents correctly, which was his way of buying space without refusing her outright. He told me he wasn't comfortable with any changes without further evaluation, given Mama's health conditions, and that he thought we might want to consult with someone about her cognitive status and whether undue influence was a factor. Undue influence? That's a legal term. I had to look it up, and when I did, my blood ran cold, because what I read described almost exactly what I was watching happen to my mother. Undue influence in estate law. It happens when someone in a position of trust, a caregiver, a close companion, uses that position to override the true wishes of a vulnerable person. It's manipulation, it's fraud, and it's devastatingly common with elderly people who are isolated from their families. Isolated. There was that word. I thought about Mama's old friends who'd stopped calling. I thought about Sandra answering the phone. I thought about the address book on the kitchen table the first time. I thought about Sandra driving Mama to appointments without telling me, being there for visits to the estate attorney, sleeping in the guest room, calling Mama's house our home. I thought about how when I visited now, Mama sometimes seemed slightly distant, slightly apologetic, like she was caught between two worlds and didn't know which one to fully inhabit. And I thought about how Sandra, every single time I was there, was warm and gracious and completely in control of the room. She had been building this, slowly, patiently, methodically. She had wormed her way into Mama's heart, and then she had started working on the walls, quietly pulling them up around Mama, cutting her off from the people who loved her, making herself indispensable, positioning herself to inherit. I was done being passive. Part 5. The moment I knew for certain. Because up until this point, I still had a small, stubborn piece of me that wanted to believe I was wrong, that I was being paranoid, that Sandra was exactly who she presented herself to be, and that my mama had just grown to love her and that was allowed. That piece of me died on a Tuesday in February. I had driven over in the middle of the day, a random Tuesday, no announcement. I'd been doing this more and more. When I got to the house, Sandra's car was there. I could hear the television from outside. I used my key and came in quietly, not to sneak, just because that's how I always come in. They were in the living room. Mama was in her recliner and Sandra was sitting on the couch, and she had Mama's financial folder in her lap. Now, the financial folder, this was a thing Mama kept in a file box in her bedroom. It had her bank statements, her investment account paperwork, her insurance policies, her property tax information, everything. I had a copy of most of it, but the originals lived in that box, and Mama kept it in her room. Sandra had it open in her lap and she was going through it, papers spread out on the coffee table. She had a notepad beside her. Mama looked up when I came in. For just a split second, just one beat, she looked guilty. Then her expression smoothed out and she said, "Renee, what a nice surprise." Sandra closed the folder, but not before I got a clear look at what was on top, Mama's investment account statement. I said very calmly, "Sandra, what is that?" And she smiled and she said, "Oh, we were just going over some paperwork. Gloria asked me to help her organize things. She gets overwhelmed with all the mail." Mama nodded. "I did ask her. It's so much to keep track of." I said, "Mama, can I talk to Sandra alone for a minute?" And Mama started to say something, started to object, but I met her eyes and she went quiet. She knew, I think, on some level, underneath whatever had been built up around her, she knew her daughter. In the kitchen, I closed the door halfway and I said to Sandra very quietly, I need you to put that folder back in my mother's room exactly where you found it, and I need you to never go through her financial documents again. Sandra looked at me with complete calm, completely unrattled. Renee, I understand this looks odd, but I promise you I'm just trying to help. Don't, I said, just don't. She paused, and then just for a moment, the smallest flicker, the warmth dropped out of her eyes. It was so fast I almost missed it, but I didn't miss it. I saw what was underneath, something calculated, something watchful, something patient and entirely without warmth. And then it was gone, and the smile came back. Of course, she said, whatever makes you comfortable. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything, every single thing, dates, incidents, conversations, what was said and by whom. I wrote for 2 hours, and when I was done, I looked at what I had written and I thought, this woman has been running a con on my mama, a slow, patient, long con, and she had almost pulled it off. I called Marcus, and then the next morning I called a lawyer. Part 6. Moving Quietly. The lawyer's name was Patricia Hughes, elder law specialist, based in Durham, recommended by a colleague whose own family had been through something similar. I got an appointment within the week. I came to that meeting with my 2 hours of notes, copies of the documents I'd been able to get my hands on, and as clear a timeline as I could construct. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting. She asked a few clarifying questions at the end. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with the steady eyes of someone who has heard this exact story before and knows exactly what to do. Here's what we're dealing with, she said. What you're describing is a textbook pattern of caregiver undue influence, the isolation of the potential testator, the insertion into financial affairs, the positioning as a beneficiary, the disruption of existing support networks. These are all documented warning signs. She told me we had several avenues available. First, we needed an independent cognitive assessment of Mama, conducted by a neuropsychologist with no connection to Sandra, to establish a clear record of Mama's cognitive status and decision-making capacity. Second, we needed to contact Mr. Whitmore immediately and formally put on record our objection to any changes to the will, which would create a paper trail that would be very difficult to work around. Third, we needed to document Sandra's presence in the home and her access to Mama's financial records. Patricia also told me something I hadn't known. In North Carolina, there are statutes specifically designed to protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation by caregivers. If we could establish that Sandra had accessed or attempted to access Mama's financial accounts or property for personal gain, that wasn't just a civil matter, that could be criminal. I asked her if I should tell Mama what I was doing. She considered that carefully. Your mother is a competent adult, and her cooperation will ultimately be necessary, but right now, if you tell her and she tells Sandra, and based on what you've described, that's likely, Sandra will change her behavior, possibly move quickly to execute whatever she's been planning, or simply deny everything and put you on the defensive. I'd recommend we move strategically and bring your mother in once we have something concrete to show her. I understood. I didn't love it. It felt like I was working around Mama rather than with her, but I understood. Marcus and I talked every day. He couldn't come back right away, but he was fully in. He was the one who thought to check whether Sandra had any history we hadn't found in our initial search, and he dug deeper than the state caregiver registry this time. He hired a private investigator in Greensboro, a woman named Dana Cartwright, who specialized in financial fraud. In the meantime, I did what I had to do quietly. I started documenting every visit. I kept notes. I started recording my phone conversations with Mama where legally permitted. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, which meant I could record calls I was a part of. I paid attention to small details I'd been letting slide. And I started talking to Mama's old friends. Miss Carolyn was the first. I called her directly, cell to cell, on a Saturday morning when I knew Sandra wasn't at Mama's. Carolyn, who'd been Mama's best friend since they taught together in the 80s, answered on the second ring, and when I told her who I was, she burst into tears. "Renee, I have been so worried," she said. "I've been calling Gloria for months, and every time that woman, that Sandra, answers and says she's not well and can't talk. I've been praying for her every day, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to intrude." She had called more than 20 times in the past 6 months. 20 times! Sandra had intercepted almost every one. In the few instances Mama had answered herself, the calls had been short, and Mama seemed distracted, like she was being listened to. I talked to 3 more of Mama's friends over the next 2 weeks. Same story, every time. They'd been systematically turned away. Dana, our investigator, called Marcus with her first findings at the end of the 3rd week. Sandra Lee Watkins had been doing this before. Not in North Carolina. She'd done it in Tennessee 8 years prior. She had been the live-in caregiver for an elderly widower named George Alcott in Knoxville. George had changed his will to include Sandra as a primary beneficiary. He had passed 6 months later. His adult children had contested the will, and the case settled out of court, meaning the family got some money back, Sandra got some money, and nothing went on any formal record. She changed her name shortly after. Her name before Sandra Lee Watkins was Sandra Lee Brewer. When Marcus called to tell me this, I had to put the phone down and just breathe for a minute. She had done this before. She had practiced this on someone else's family, and she had almost gotten away with it, and she had come here, and she had started again. My Mama was not going to be George Alcott. Part 7. The Evidence Stacks Up. Dana wasn't done. She'd pulled Sandra's financial records through legal channels. She had contacts. She knew how to do this. And what she found was that Sandra had credit card debt in excess of $40,000, 2 liens on a property she'd owned and since lost to foreclosure, and no retirement savings to speak of. She was 53 years old, and she was broke, and she was desperate, and she had found my Mama, and she had made a plan. The neuropsychological evaluation came back clean. Mama was sharp. Her memory, her reasoning, her judgment, all within normal range for her age. What the evaluator noted was interesting. Mama showed signs of social deference to a dominant personality in her immediate environment, which is clinical language for what I'd been watching with my own eyes. She wasn't cognitively impaired. She was under the thumb of someone who'd spent a year carefully making herself the most important person in Mama's world. Patricia Hughes said that actually worked in our favor in some ways. It meant Mama's choices weren't being made for her. They were being heavily influenced. Undue influence doesn't require someone to be incapacitated. It requires someone to have overborne another person's free will through a relationship of trust. Clean cognition plus documented pattern of control actually strengthens an undue influence claim. I met with Mr. Whitmore officially, with Patricia present. We filed a formal letter requesting that no changes be made to Gloria Carter's estate documents without the presence and approval of her attorney of record, Patricia, and her children. Whitmore was relieved. He'd been uncomfortable, and now he had legal cover to do what his instincts had been telling him. Marcus had flown back to Greensboro by this point. He was staying at a hotel rather than Mama's house, so Sandra wouldn't know he was in town. That was important. We needed Sandra to act. We needed her to do something concrete and documentable before we brought everything to Mama. And Dana had a suggestion. She told us to let the next appointment at Whitmore's office happen. Don't cancel it. Don't interfere. Let Sandra take Mama in. Let them try to push the will change through, because Whitmore would stall them again. He had instructions to do exactly that. And while they were there, Dana would be in the parking lot, legally and clearly documenting who went in, how long they stayed, and what could be observed. And Marcus and I would be at the house. Why the house? Because Dana also suspected, based on Sandra's financial pattern and the information she'd gathered, that Sandra may have been helping herself to small amounts from Mama's accounts, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter. And she thought we might find evidence at the house if we looked carefully while Sandra was out. I want to be very clear. We didn't break into anything. This was my mother's house. I had a key. I had always had a key. I was authorized to be there. What we found in the guest room Sandra had been occupying was a spiral notebook. Not hidden exactly, it was in the nightstand drawer, which we opened because we were being thorough. In that notebook, in Sandra's own handwriting, were notes. Notes about Mama's accounts, notes about the trust, notes that appeared to be a rough list of the assets and their estimated values. Notes, and this is the one that made Marcus have to leave the room, that included a list of Mama's friends and family members with notations next to their names. Miss Carolyn, still calling, need to redirect. Marcus, not present, low risk. Me, my name, with a star next to it and the word resistant. She had made a list of the people in my Mama's life, and she had assessed each of us as a risk factor to her plan. I photographed every page with my phone, then put the notebook back exactly as we'd found it. Part 8, Bringing It Home. The hardest conversation of my life was the one I had with my Mama. Not the confrontation with Sandra, that was satisfying. The conversation with Mama, where I had to sit across from the woman who raised me and show her what had been done to her, what she'd almost been a part of, that was devastating. Because I loved her and I didn't want to hurt her, and I knew this was going to hurt. We chose a Sunday. Sandra didn't work Sundays. Marcus and I came together and we brought Patricia with us. Mama was in her usual chair with her Bible when we came in. She looked surprised to see Patricia, but not alarmed. I sat next to her and I held her hand and I said, "Mama, I need you to show you some things and I need you to look at all of them before you say anything, okay? Just trust me for a little while." And she looked at me, really looked at me, and she said, "Baby, you've got that look you had when you were 12 and you'd found something you weren't supposed to know." Yeah, I've got that look. We went through everything. Patricia laid it out carefully, methodically, professionally. The prior case in Knoxville, the financial records, the notebook, the phone interceptions, the pattern. Mama was quiet through it all. I watched her face. I watched her process each piece. I watched something shift in her eyes, not just hurt, but recognition, like something she'd felt dimly without a name for it was suddenly getting labeled. When it was over, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She told me you two were just having trouble accepting that I needed help, that you didn't understand the bond that forms between a caregiver and a patient. She said Marcus was never present and that you were controlling." Marcus said very gently, "Mama, I know. And she pressed her lips together and her eyes got wet and she said, "I let that woman sit at my table." Mama, she's very good at what she does. She's done it before. I should have known. Mama shook her head slowly. Something felt not wrong, but I don't know. A few times I thought something felt odd, but she was always so warm. She seemed to love me. She loved what you had, and I hated saying it, but Mama needed to hear it clearly. Mama sat with that for a moment. Then she squared her shoulders and her chin came up, that Gloria Jean Carter chin, the one that meant the decision had been made and the matter was closed, and she said, "All right, what do we do?" Part 9. The Justice. We moved on multiple fronts, and we moved fast. The first thing we did was terminate Sandra's employment. Patricia drafted a formal letter of termination, noting that it was effective immediately and that Sandra was to return any keys to the property and remove any personal belongings within 48 hours with Marcus or me present. We hand-delivered it on a Monday morning. Sandra's reaction was remarkable in its own way. She kept the warmth up through almost the entire conversation. She was confused, she said. She was hurt. She couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. She talked about her bond with Mama, her commitment to Gloria's well-being. She suggested we were acting out of jealousy and fear. But when I told her, very calmly, that we had the notebook, everything changed. Just for a second, that same flicker I'd seen in the kitchen months ago, the warmth dropped completely, and what was underneath it was cold and sharp and mean. She covered it fast, but we all saw it. Even Marcus, who'd wanted to believe the best until the very end, took a step back. She said the notebook was nothing, just notes she kept for herself about her client's situation, completely standard. I said, "We have photographs of every page." She said she was going to call her own lawyer. I said, "That's a great idea." She left within the hour. She never came back. The second front, Patricia filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees caregiver licensing. We submitted our documentation, the notebook, Dana's investigative report, the evidence of phone interceptions, the statements from Mama's friends, the record of unauthorized financial record access. The complaint also referenced the prior Knoxville case, which Dana's investigation had surfaced, and formally requested an investigation into whether Sandra Watkins had committed professional misconduct. The third front, because of the documented access to Mama's financial records and the potential for financial exploitation, Patricia also referred the matter to the local district attorney's office. North Carolina has a financial exploitation of a disabled or elder adult statute, and while Mama hadn't lost any money yet, Sandra had been careful, or perhaps she'd been waiting until the will change was complete. The attempt itself and the documented pattern of manipulation was sufficient for the DA's office to open a file. The fourth front, Mr. Whitmore quietly and thoroughly documented his own observations of Sandra's behavior during the will consultation visits and submitted a sworn statement about the pressure that had been applied in his office. He'd been uncomfortable with the whole thing, he said. He was glad to have the opportunity to go on record. Sandra's own attorney apparently advised her almost immediately that fighting was not in her interest. The combination of the prior Knoxville case, the notebook, the licensing complaint, and the DA investigation created a wall of accountability that she had not anticipated. She had been careful in Knoxville. She had been less careful here because she'd felt secure by month 14, because she thought she had us all managed. She had not managed me. The licensing board revoked Sandra Lee Watkins' caregiver certification. The investigation found multiple violations of the Caregiver Ethics Code, including unauthorized access to client financial records, disruption of clients' established support network, and conflict of interest related to estate planning. The revocation was public record. Anyone who searched her name would find it. The DA ultimately declined to prosecute criminally, citing insufficient evidence of completed financial gain, but the file remained open, and the public record of the licensing revocation was, as Patricia told me, something Sandra would be dragging around for the rest of her professional life. She would never again be licensed to care for a vulnerable adult in North Carolina. She would likely not be licensed in any state, given that multi-state caregiver registries share information. There was a civil matter, too. Patricia sent Sandra a demand letter related to her unauthorized use of Mama's financial documents and her interference with her personal communications and relationships. Given Sandra's financial situation, the credit card debt, the liens, the foreclosure, there wasn't much to recover. But Sandra's attorney reached back with an offer, a written, notarized letter of admission that Sandra had acted improperly in her care of Gloria Carter in exchange for us not pursuing the civil case further. Patricia said this was actually more valuable in some ways than money because it created an official record in Sandra's own words. We accepted. Mama's will remained exactly as it had always been. Marcus and I were her beneficiaries, as it should have been. The trust documents were reviewed and reaffirmed. Mr. Whitmore retired within the year and referred us to his associate, a sharp young woman whom Mama adored. Everything was documented, witnessed, and clean. Part 10. Putting it back together. The aftermath was its own kind of work. Mama was okay. She really was. She's tougher than anyone gives her credit for. Always has been. She was angry, properly angry, the kind of anger that comes from knowing you were deceived. But she wasn't broken. She said to me one Sunday afternoon, a few months after everything, "I've lived 74 years, Renee. I have been through things that would have laid other people flat. One deceitful woman is not going to undo any of that." I said, "No, ma'am, it is not." She laughed, and it was that big, room-filling laugh, and I could breathe again. Reconnecting with her friends was easier than I'd feared, and harder in some ways. Miss Carolyn came over within a week of Sandra's termination, and she and Mama sat on that porch for 3 hours talking. I didn't join them. That was their time. I sat inside and listened to the murmur of their voices and felt something loosen in my chest. The other friends came back one by one. Some were hurt. Some had assumed that Mama had pulled back by choice and had felt rejected. We had to do some repair work. But Gloria Jean Carter, in full possession of herself, is magnetic and warm and irresistible, and she pulled them back in without much effort. We found a new caregiver through a proper agency this time, with oversight and background checks and structured supervision. Her name is Dolores. She's got 30 years of experience, and she and Mama discuss soap operas with an intensity that makes me laugh out loud. It took Mama a few weeks to warm up. She was understandably guarded, but Dolores is steady and professional and absolutely clear about what her role is and isn't. She is there to take care of Mama. Full stop. She doesn't answer the phone. She doesn't attend legal appointments. She doesn't sleep in the guest room. She goes home at 4 o'clock every day. That's how it should have been from the start. Marcus came back to visit 2 more times that year, which was more than he'd managed in the previous 3 years combined. I think the whole situation scared him into presence, which is maybe the one thing Sandra accidentally did for us. He couldn't fix the years of distance in a few visits, but he tried, and Mama noticed, and that counted. My own relationship with Mama deepened in the way that only comes from having gone through something hard together. There was a night about 4 months after all of this was resolved when we were sitting in her kitchen after dinner, and she said to me, quietly, "I want you to know that even when Sandra was working on me, I never stopped knowing you were my daughter. I just got confused about some things." I said, "Mama, you don't have to explain." She said, "I want to. I want you to know that some part of me always knew something wasn't right. But she was so patient and she was always there, and you were always so busy with your life. Mama, I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I want us both to understand what happened so we can be smarter." I looked at her across that kitchen table in the house she'd lived in for 37 years, under the overhead light that was slightly too bright and the clock on the wall that had always run 2 minutes fast. My mama, 74 years old, back in full possession of herself and her home and her life. I said, "We are smarter, Mama. That's the only good thing." She reached across and patted my hand, just like she had patted Sandra's hand that first day. The difference was that Mama's hand on mine was the real thing, and it always had been. Epilogue. What I know now. People ask me sometimes when I tell this story, and I've told it plenty, what the lesson is, what they should watch out for, how to protect their own parents. I'll tell you what I tell them. Watch for the drift. A good caregiver makes your family's existing relationships better. They facilitate connection, they support it, they celebrate it. A predator makes those connections inconvenient. Slow down and notice if you're reaching your loved one less, if you're being redirected, if visits are subtly discouraged. Watch the money. Any caregiver who has access to financial documents, who accompanies a client to legal appointments without being asked, who becomes part of conversations about estate planning, that is a boundary being crossed, and it doesn't cross by accident. Watch the will. I cannot say this clearly enough. If someone in your parent's life starts working their way into inheritance conversations, you need to act. Not in a year, not in a month, now. And watch yourself. Watch your own reluctance to believe it. Sandra almost won, not because she was so clever, but because I was so desperate to believe in the good version of the story. I wanted her to be exactly what she looked like, because if she was, my problem was solved. That desire, that very human, very understandable desire, is what people like Sandra count on. They are patient because they know we don't want to see what they're doing. Document everything. Date everything. Get a lawyer who knows elder law. Talk to the estate attorney. Get an independent cognitive evaluation if there's any question. These things feel heavy and drastic when you first consider them, but they are so much lighter than the alternative. My mama is fine, more than fine. She turned 75 last spring, and we had a party in her backyard with 23 people, and her cornbread was as perfect as it has ever been. Sandra Lee Watkins, or Sandra Lee Brewer, or whatever name she's using these days, cannot legally care for a vulnerable adult anywhere her name shows up on a registry. The written admission sits in a file with my attorney. The DA's open file sits wherever DA files sit. She walked away with nothing, just like she deserved. And my mama is sitting in her house, in her chair, with her Bible and her friends and her family around her, right where she belongs. Nobody messes with my mama.